Okay, persistence through time. This is a combination, a sort of overlap of two topics that we've touched on already in the course. Of course, we began talking about time, looking at A series and B series, and McTaggart's argument for the unreality of time. And just recently, we've been talking about physical objects, material objects. How are they constituted? How are they composed? Those are two different issues, composition and constitution, and we're going to be talking about constitution a bit more today. They sort of come together in this issue of how do physical objects persist through time, which again might not seem like the most pressing issue, but it does set up the last unit, which is a larger unit because it's a topic that I think is kind of fun, on personal identity, or how do humans persist through time? What is it that makes a baby the same as a 56-year-old man? What is it that's the same across all this time? How is it that we can say that I have persisted through time? That has special issues when applied to humans rather than just any old physical object. But the debate about personal identity presumes knowledge of the broader topic of persistence through time. So, basically, there are two main views about how physical objects persist through time, with a third one that's a more recent contender that seems a little weird, and the only reasons to believe in it, I think, are that it avoids some of the major criticisms of the other two. But probably the intuitive way, the way that people who haven't taken any philosophy classes believe, is called endurance. You might think of this as three-dimensionalism. That is, objects exist all at once right now. So, for example, using me as an example. Here's me as a baby in 1968. Here's me in my the second and third terms of my first year and first year of my second year at university, where I experimented with a mohawk, and I had little round John Lennon glasses before I got my contact lenses. So there I am. I'm happy. It was a good time. Well, had its ups and downs, but I remember it fondly. And then here I am, slightly paunchier, slightly more defeated, less hair, that kind of thing. Okay, so this is me. Now, endurance, according to endurance, me as a baby, is the same entity as B, me in university as an undergraduate, is the same entity as me now. So I existed entirely in 1968. I existed entirely in 1987. I exist entirely now. They're all me and they're all identical. Now, there's a lot of problems with maintaining that, as we'll see. But that's what most of us would say. I think that's the intuitive view. The four-dimensionalist view, or the view that I am a four-dimensional object, implies a view called perdurance. That is, perdurance is the way that four-dimensional objects persist through time. That is, this is not me, this is not me, this is not me. The whole thing added together is me. This is like the usual term is space-time worms. I am a space-time worm. If you have ever seen the movie Donnie Darko, kind of a cult movie, Jake Gyllenhaal's star-making movie, you sort of get a pictorial representation of space-time worms in there. He sees objects and they have like silvery trails going behind them. This might be indicating a space-time worm. That is, I am a single object that begins when I come into existence, whenever we decide that is. Birth, conception, somewhere in between. Whenever I started to exist, that's the beginning of the space-time worm, and the end of it is sometime in the future when I cease to exist. Again, there's some dispute about that. Do I cease to exist when brain death occurs? Do I cease to exist when all of my body shuts down? Do I cease to exist when the physical object that is me crumbles? Am I my corpse? That's a genuine philosophical debate. Some people say, I cease to exist as soon as I die. Then what is this thing, my corpse? Where did that come from, and how is it different from me? And some people, for example, philosopher Fred Feldman, argue that I am my corpse. So I continue to exist for some time after death, until presumably I rot away or am burnt or whatever. But however you decide the beginning and ending points, I am everything in between. There's a single object, and it's four-dimensional. So, what is this? What is this? It's not me, it's just a slice of me. Like, if instead of space-time worms, you can think of them as space-time sausages or space-time bologna. This is a slice of the bologna that has, at each moment, you might say it has no thickness whatsoever. It is a three-dimensional object because it has no time slice. But also you can talk about temporal parts of me. You can talk about my teenage years. My teenage years is a part of me. The part that, starts on my 13th birthday and ends on the day before my 20th birthday, let's say. That is a temporal part of me. That's a chunk of the sausage during which time I was a teenager. And that is a temporal part of me. Or you can talk about, my married years or whatever. These are all different temporal parts of me. But there's only one me, and it's the entire sum of all my temporal parts. So, what's the difference in practice? In practice, it doesn't really affect us that much. You can make jokes, like I always say, there's the joke about the people who come into a tiny town and they see a guy leaning on a fence, chawing on a piece of grass, and they get to talking to him and they ask him, "Have you lived here all your life?" And he says, "Not yet." That sort of takes the Perdurance view, that he is his entire life. Now, even people who take the Endurance view, who say that objects are three-dimensional, think that some things perdure. For example, events. World War II doesn't exist all at once on a particular day. And of course, World War II starts at different points depending on whether you're European or American. Americans talk about it starting in, 1941, whereas Europeans, the English people, talk about 1939, and so on. But whatever, it's an object that is, it's an event that is extended in time. So Perdurance theorists say objects are just like events. They are also extended in time. Now, what is Exdurance? Well, in order to explain it, you kind of need to know the motivation for it. But I'll give it a shot. It's like Endurance, in that this is me, this is entirely me. So in that sense, it's like Endurance. But it doesn't suggest that this was also me. So it doesn't say that this is also me. it says that this is a counterpart of me. And here you have to know a little bit about David Lewis's counterpart theory of counterfactuals. So for example, remember, his theory says, I could have been a plumber, let's say. Let's say it's true, I could have been a plumber. What makes the statement, I could have been a plumber, true? Answer, a really existing possible world in which a person exists who is a plumber, and that person is my counterpart. Now, what Lewis does not say is that that person is me. Lewis is very much committed to something called Leibniz's law that we'll get to in a second. Well, I can give you the basic version, which says anything to be me, in order to be me, has to have all of my properties. And clearly, this person in this other possible world does not have all of my properties, because I'm a philosophy teacher, and that person's a plumber. So we disagree. So we can't be identical. Lewis says in order to be identical, you have to have all the same properties. But what he does say is that person is my counterpart, and that person is what makes it true that I could have been a plumber, because that person is similar to me in enough other respects to make them my counterpart, and the fact that it is possible for them to be a plumber shows that it would have been possible for me. All right, so Exdurance suggests that this is my counterpart. It's not me, I am just this. It's a being that exists that makes it true that in 1987 I was like that. Okay, weird theory, again, only worth getting into if you know the problems it solves. So, how do you decide which camp you want to fall in? Am I a perdurance theorist, or am I an endurance theorist? You are no doubt asking yourself. You know, well, you can just sit around and think, which makes more sense to me? Which seems more intuitive? But, you know, it's not really something I think most people have intuitions about. It's only philosophers who become incredibly committed to one or other of the camps because of arguments about related issues that they think their particular view explains with the fewest number of implausibilities or problems. All right. So one issue that leads one to take a position on whether or not objects perdure or endure is the paradox of change, which is one of the oldest puzzles in philosophy. I talked about it last time. It's a pre-Socratic puzzle. It goes back, you know, more than 2 millennia. Yeah, a good deal more than, probably about 2.5 millennia at least. And it goes a bit like this. Change, one of the weird things about change is that change seems to require both difference and sameness. That is, in order for something to change, it has to be it has to have properties that are different. So for example, here's a ripening tomato, or tomato as I used to say before I was corrupted, who at this earlier time is green, and at this later time T2 is red. Call the earlier, if you were a Perdurance theorist, you would say the earlier stage or time slice or temporal part is A, and the later stage or temporal part is B. If you're an endurance theorist, you say the tomato, call the tomato at this time A, and call the tomato at this time B. Anyway, the fact that they have, well, the one is green and the other is red represents difference. That's one of the elements to change. If there was no difference, if they were both green or both red, then we wouldn't say change had happened. It has to be that there's difference. Okay, so that's the difference condition. I'm using the terminology from Ryan Wasserman's article, The Problem of Change. I'm not sure it's the best terminology, and in particular, he seems to mess up a little in defining incompatibility, but I've written it on the board, so I'm stuck with it now. And it's got the key elements. Okay, so there has to be difference. In order for there to be change, there has to be difference. Otherwise, nothing's changed. But there also has to be sameness, because if I just say, you know, oh, look, look, this yellow pen has changed into an orange pen. No, it hasn't. That's not change, that's replacement. Why isn't that change? Because they're not the same pen. In order for change to happen, you would have to, this yellow thing would have to be one and the same object as this orange thing. Now, this is what puzzled the ancients right away. How is it that you can both have difference and sameness? That's incompatible. Therefore, change is impossible. One way to immediately respond to that is to say, well, no, these are two different things. There's numerical identity, two different concepts of identity. Yes, numerical identity and qualitative identity. Qualitative identity is the sense being used in the phrase identical twins. Identical twins are not numerically identical. They're not one and the same individual. They're very much two individuals. And one of them is always evil. It's a rule. But numerical identity is the concept of identity embodied in the equal sign. You know, Bruce Wayne is one and the same. One and the same it means numerical identity. Hence, one. Whereas qualitative is just like has all of the same qualities but need not be identical. But the trouble is, Leibniz's law, named after the great philosopher Leibniz, and the trouble with Leibniz's law is it seems to be at least two different laws, and people use the phrase Leibniz's law as if it's just one. The sense in which we're interested now is the indiscernibility of identicals. That's the principle that, for example, David Lewis is committed to, which is why he came up with counterpart theory. That is, and that's another way of saying that numerical identicals will be qualitatively identical. So it forestalls the usual response to the puzzle of change of just saying, oh, the ancients were confused. They didn't distinguish between numerical identity, which we want, which is the sameness that we're talking about here. It has to be one and the same, but it doesn't have to. But you can have difference in qualitative. So that if you say, well, this is numerical and this is qualitative, it seems like they no longer clash anymore. But once you add in Leibniz's law, you can't get away with that. And there's also the problem, what Wasserman calls the incompatibility criterion, which is essentially the law of non-contradiction. That is, you cannot have you cannot have the same thing have contradictory properties. And being green and being red are contradictory properties. Now, because we'll assume that when we say green, it's short for green all over. It's like to avoid jokes like what's black and white and red all over. You know, what is it? A newspaper, a sunburnt penguin, a zebra in a blender. Anyway, so what we're saying here is that this is green all over and that is incompatible with being red all over. One single thing cannot be both those things. Okay, so that's the paradox. It seems like we believe that change happens, and yet change seems to be impossible because the requirements of change lead to a contradiction. How do we solve this? Well, one way to solve it is that there is literally change doesn't happen, we just have constant replacement. That is, this is a new object, and it's not one and the same object with that. The ancient philosopher Heraclitus seemed to hold this view, most famous for the statement, "You never step into the same river twice." Now, we think of that in terms of, well, if you step into a river, step out and step in again, it's made of completely different water by the time you step in. And he's using this as an analogy. We're all flux. We're all changing all the time. So there aren't real persisting objects. The philosopher David Hume seems to have something like that view too. But that's a very extreme and radical view, because it implies, certainly if we apply it to individuals. I mean, if I promise to give you $10 and then you come back 5 minutes later saying, okay, where's my $10? I can't say, well, I didn't promise you $10. I promised the thing that existed 10 minutes ago, but that doesn't exist anymore and you're entirely new. That's not going to wash with you. You're going to say, no, I'm the same guy. I'm the same person. So we are very much committed to the concept of change. It seems like just a cop-out to deny that change happens. So, what is a way of dealing with this? Well, the Perdurance theorist, the first move is to deny that actually there really is a difference. Because what you can say is, look, obviously it's impossible for the same thing to be green all over and red all over. Sure, that's impossible. But that's not what's happening here. What's happening is that the same thing is green all over at this time and red all over at this time. And once you bring time in, that removes the incompatibility. It is perfectly possible to be green all over at one time and red all over at another time. That's not incompatible. So we don't have a contradiction. We don't violate the incompatibility criterion. It would be incompatible if it was just apple is green and apple is red. That would violate this criterion. But if you say apple is red at this time, green at this time, apple is red at this time, then it seems to solve the problem. Now, there are different ways of cashing this out, depending on your metaphysical views about how the relationship between time and propositions. That is, propositions, of course, are ways of capturing information. They are the meanings of declarative sentences. We talk about them in logic classes. And the ancient Greeks, Aristotle in particular, well, Plato actually paved the way, analyzed propositions in terms of subjects and properties. So predication is at the core of propositions, according to the way we've understood them from the beginning of Western philosophy. So a proposition is a thing that can have truth value, that captures some information by predicating, saying that some property is true of some subject. And if you take a logic class, you will learn about predicates and quantifiers and stuff like that, which is a way of symbolizing propositions. All right. If we're going to introduce time into propositions, which we don't, if you take an introduction to philosophy to logic class, time doesn't occur. We just talk about subjects, whether names or variables, having predicates attached to them. So Kermit is green, you symbolize Kermit with a little k, and the predicate is green with a big G, and you say big G, little k, that's Kermit is green. Or something is green, you've got the existential quantifier, big G and then a variable, say x. There's no mention of time. It's timeless predication. But unless we introduce time, we're not going to be able to explain how change is possible. It doesn't lead to a contradiction. So where do we introduce the timiness? Well, if you are what's called a serious tensor, you say that propositions by their very nature are tensed entities. So that is saying that the tomato was green is not the same as saying that the tomato is green. They are saying different things. Even though it's the same property, well, actually, you can decide three different ways on how the time gets introduced. The Perdurance theorist says that it's the object that has the time attached to it, and this leaves the properties unaffected. And this is something that people like David Lewis think is a huge advantage for the Perdurance theorist. So let's see how the Perdurance theorist explains change while avoiding a contradiction. So what's going on here? What the Perdurance theorist says is that change is happening in the tomato that is that has A as one time slice and B as another time slice. So the tomato that is all of these things changes because it has a part that is green and it has a part that is red. So there is change because the parts are not the same, but there's no contradiction because there's no single part that is both red and green. Because that's what we can't have. We can't, to avoid contradiction, we cannot be claiming that a single thing has incompatible properties. And incompatible properties would be being red and being green. So the way that Perdurance theorist avoids that contradiction is by saying it's not a single thing that is red and green. It's one thing that's green and one thing that's red. Now, that sounds like replacement. That sounds like, well, this is yellow and this is orange. Well, that wasn't change, was it? But what the Perdurance theorist says is, yes, but together they're part of a single thing. So you can speak in the way that the tomato is green and the tomato is red because over here this part of the tomato is green and over here this part of the tomato is red. So you are in some sense preserving sameness. So when we're talking about sameness, we're talking about the time worm. When we're talking about difference, we're talking about the time slices. So we get this sameness and difference not contradicting each other. Now, the usual response to this from opponents of Perdurance is that isn't real change. That's just replacement disguised. And our old pal McTaggart has a good analogy. He says, imagine I stick my poker in the fire, the end of it gets red hot, but the part that I'm holding is cool. There's no change there simply because part of the poker is red and part of the poker is black. Part of the poker is hot and part of the poker is cold. That, we don't say here's change because one part is one thing and the other part is another. But you're saying that there is change because one part is green and one part is red. But that's not change. That's too static, which is the usual criticism against B-theorist view of time. It's static. So that's the criticism that is leveled against Perdurance. Now, what perdurance theorists say in response is, well, but there is, sure, your poker analogy makes it sound like there isn't change, but I can give another case where we do talk about change. For example, if you're driving through Nebraska, you would say the scenery doesn't change. But if you're driving through, I don't know, England, the scenery does change. And what does it mean to say the scenery changed? We say that over here in the fenlands of England, it's flat, whereas, you know, go into, well, actually, there isn't very high parts. Well, York certainly goes, no, Sheffield goes up and down a lot. So, you know, or Bristol actually has the steepest street in England in it. So the scenery does change. And what do we mean the scenery change? We don't mean that, you know, England is constantly doing this, that there's seismic activity. No, it's the fenlands always stay flat. Bristol is always hilly. But we still talk about the scenery changing. And the reason is because we're driving through it. Well, in a sense, you could say, we drive through the life cycle of this tomato, because that's how time works. So that's the response. They've got a response to that criticism. But certainly that moves a lot of endurance theorists. Okay, so if you don't like the endurance solution to the paradox of change, sorry, if you don't like the perdurance solution, what can the endurance theorists say? Notice, by the way, that we haven't yet even touched on different theories of time, different ontologies of time that are usually thought to match up. So, for example, internalism is supposed to match up with perdurance theory. Internalism is the view that all ages exist at once, that dinosaurs exist, just not now. But dinosaurs exist in exactly the way that I exist. So it's sort of the time version of David Lewis's modal realism. Lewis says, you know, that angels exist, just not in our world, but there is a possible world in which they exist. And this is the time equivalent. Dinosaurs exist, just not now. But there they are existing in the, you know, Cretaceous, Jurassic, and the other one, Triassic. They do exist back then, and they exist in exactly the same way that we exist. That's eternalism. Contrast that with presentism, and presentism says only the present exists. So reality is three-dimensional. Reality does not have a temporal dimension. Only the present exists. That seems to match up neatly with endurance theorists. However, not necessarily, and there are crossovers. Certainly, it's probably true to say that most perdurance theorists are eternalists. Very few would be presentists. That would be a weird view. If you were a presentist perdurance theorist, then you would have to say that only part of me exists at any time. I do not exist wholly. Just parts of me exist. That's weird. There aren't whole objects. There are only tiny parts of objects. That's a strange view. So it's not a pairing up. Probably some philosopher somewhere defends this view, perdurance presentism, but it's not a popular view. So if you're going to be a presentist, you're probably going to be an endurance theorist, almost certainly. Not all endurance theorists are presentists, though. So there are endurance theorists who believe in eternalism. And in fact, if you're going to talk about events like World War II, then presentism gives you the same problems as I just said for perdurance theorists. you would have to say that World War II does not exist. Only tiny fragments of World War II. Well, actually now World War II doesn't exist at all. That's a problem for any presentist. But well, maybe you don't see it as a problem. But for example, if you're an endurance presentist who thinks that I wholly exist right now because I'm a three-dimensional thing, if you believe in events like birthday parties that go from the morning to the afternoon, then you would say the party never exists, never wholly exists. It only exists in tiny fragments. So there are endurance theorists who are also eternalists. That's a matchup that's certainly more common than Perdurance and Presentism. All right, but put that aside for now. We don't even need to get into that just yet. We're still looking at the endurance. How does the endurance theorist deal with the puzzle of change? Well, suppose you say instead that, if you're an endurance theorist, you say this is the apple, this is the apple. They are one and the same, so you believe in this equal sign. The Perdurance theorist does not believe in that equal sign, but the endurance theorist believes, yes, this is the same thing as this. But they have incompatible properties. Well, relationism is the view that all properties are properties at a time. So, no entity is just green. What it is green at a certain time. So again, if you've taken a logic class, you will know that predicates come in various flavors. There's simple predicates, you could call them, that are one-place predicates, like, I don't know, sour. So citric acid is, or this drink is sour. That would be, you would use a name for this drink because it's a particular definite thing, and then you would have a one-place predicate for is sour. But there are also other predicates that capture relations. So, for example, is bigger than. So that is a predicate that has to apply to two things at once. It doesn't just have a subject, it has an object as well. So that predicate, you can only make a well-formed proposition if you have two entities connected to that predicate. So, you know, Manute Bol is bigger than Muggsy Bogues. That's, or I don't know, Victor Wembanyama is bigger than Dennis Schroeder. There you go. That's a more up-to-date example. So that is a relation. The one-place predicate is just a property. The two-place predicate is a relation. So what this does is it says essentially there are no such things as one-place predicates. Everything is a relation to a time. And so actually if you have a two-place predicate like is bigger than, now you have a three-place predicate because it's bigger than at a time. Because, you know, for all we know, Victor Wembanyama could have a horrible accident and have his legs amputated, and suddenly Dennis Schroeder is bigger than him. This move, relationism, has that effect of basically getting rid of one-place predicates. Instead of there's no such thing as simply being green. Being green simpliciter, as philosophers like to say. They like their Latin. Now, what's wrong with saying that? Well, David Lewis's complaint is kind of famous, even though, as Wasserman makes clear, it's not entirely clear exactly what he means. And you'll find this is common in philosophy, that there will be something that lots of people write on, and there's no real agreement of what exactly it is that they're writing on. For example, Wittgenstein's private language argument. Very few people can agree on what that is. They know it's there and it's important, but they don't quite know what it is. And David Lewis, who in many respects I think is a very clear writer, but sometimes too succinct. However, his complaint about this strategy of turning every property into a relation to time is called the problem of temporary intrinsics. Okay, intrinsics are properties that we have just because of the way we are. So, and we would normally have said being green is an intrinsic property. It is a property that you have even if you were the only thing in the universe. And then changes, if things were being added to the universe, it wouldn't affect your intrinsic property. So your intrinsic property is a property that you have just because of the way you are. And by you, I can mean any object. Contrast that with extrinsic properties or relations. And the classic example of an extrinsic property is being an uncle. I am an uncle, but you couldn't work that out by examining. You could know everything about all my intrinsic properties. You could examine me under an electron microscope, and you wouldn't be able to tell if I was an uncle or not. Because what makes me an uncle is the existence of my nieces and nephew. So that's an extrinsic property. It's a property I have because of something else. Now, there's an interesting question as to whether I change if my extrinsic properties change. And in fact, there's a name for this. It's called Cambridge change. So supposing we say that human beings start to exist at birth. Well, it turns out my older my older niece and nephew were twins, and they were born incredibly prematurely. Polly weighed under 2 pounds, and Sam weighed just over 2 pounds. And they were the smallest babies that had existed in that particular hospital, and it was kind of a miracle that they survived, and they're doing well. But, you know, suppose we say they begin to exist the minute they leave my sister. And suppose I wasn't paying attention. Suppose my sister and I had become estranged, or I was off competing in that TV show alone, where you're cut off from the world, or I'd been lost at sea. Like Tom Hanks in Cast Away. So at the moment I become an uncle, I'm completely unaware of it. Have I changed? Doesn't really sound like I have. That's not real change. That's Cambridge change. Because I could be, in fact, that kind of change happens to us all the time. We could say things are happening on the other side of the universe. A new star is born the other side of the universe. Another one has just gone nova. So therefore I've changed. Why? Because my relationship, I now have a relationship of existing in the same universe as something where I didn't before. So I've changed. That doesn't sound like using the word change correctly. So changing in your extrinsic properties doesn't really sound like change. Whereas real change has to be changing in your intrinsic properties. You have to have, for change to happen, there have to be such things as temporary intrinsic properties. We have some intrinsic properties that are essential to us. They can't change without us ceasing to be us. Now, what they are is a matter of some dispute. Let's say, and that's to do with counterfactuals. Could I have been a goldfish? Let's say we decide no, because I am essentially human. Then I will never me being human is an intrinsic property of me that is permanent. It's never going to change, because if I cease to be human, then I cease to exist. But I have some intrinsic properties, like being 6'2". That's a property that I have. Well, you might get into, well, you're only 6'2" because of the existence of measurements. Shut up. Let's say 6'2" is as an intrinsic property of me, but it's a temporary one. I mean, I didn't used to be 6'2", and as my bones settle, I'll get smaller, as old people always do. It's probably already started. So that's an intrinsic property of me that is temporary. And that's why I am able to change. So if you change all properties into relations, essentially there are no intrinsic properties. Every property is now extrinsic, and then it doesn't sound like we've got change. We haven't got real change, we've got Cambridge change. Now, as Wasserman says, there are three ways to interpret Lewis's complaint, that this view called relationism, because it turns all properties into relations, fails to account for change. Lewis sometimes writes as if the relationist forsakes properties altogether, so that the enduring object becomes a bare particular without color, shape, or mass. Yeah, so it sounds like if all properties are relations, then I have nothing intrinsic to me, so you can't even talk about me as an object. Or perhaps the problem is supposed to be that the relationist does away with intrinsic properties. Now there's a response to that Sally Haslanger makes, and you can look that up. Perhaps the problem is that the relationship forsakes temporary intrinsic properties. After all, the tomato always has the property of being green at T1 and red at T2. These are properties that are, so the tomato, you can say of the tomato at any time that it is green at T1. So there's no point at which you can say the tomato is green and then it stops being green. Whereas, according to the Perdurance, you can say this is never green and this is never red. So there's genuine disagreement. Whereas this is both red at T2 and green at T1. And this is both green at T1 and red at T2. So change never happens. There's no temporary intrinsics. In the end, says Russman, I think we should read Lewis as simply insisting that some things have the property of being bent or being green. That is, he refuses to give up on one-place predicates. Anyway, that's the most famous objection to that move, to avoid the paradox of change. Alternatively, there's a variety of views. Lewis calls this tensing the copula. Now, what is the copula? Well, it's the source of our word copulate. What is copulation? It's joining. That's what you're doing when you copulate, you're joining. As the Spice Girls says, when two become one. So what is the copula in a proposition? It's the thing that connects the subject and the predicate. If you learn about categorical propositions, like all frogs are green, it's the are. So all is the quantifier, and frogs is the subject, green is the predicate, and the word are is called the copula. It's the thing that joins the subject to the predicate. Now, Lewis wrote an article called Tensing the Copula, objecting to instead of saying that all properties are relations to time, you have the subject that is being predicated. That's the same thing. You have a simple property, green. It's not green at T1, it's just green. But then you have the connection between the two being the thing that has the timiness built in, the temporal properties. And so that avoids the complaint that you're getting rid of intrinsic properties, because green is an intrinsic property. And it gets rid of the complaint against this, that there's no change because this is a different object from this. No, it's just one object. But then you're just saying that the connection between the subject and the predicate is tensed. And so hence called tensing the copula. Or sometimes another version of this is called adverbialism. Adverbs, of course, are like the adjectives of verbs. That is, like, as everybody misuses hopefully, as grammar sticklers say, hopefully is an adverb. That is, you can travel hopefully, but you can't say, hopefully I'll be there on time. You're misusing the word hopefully, except, that's accepted usage now. So basically, adverbs are the things that end in ly, and they're the way that verbs happen. So traveling is a verb, and it can be done quickly, or it can be done hopefully. So this is like you have the property, and this is the way you have it. Yeah, adverbs can work on adjectives as well, I guess. Now, Lewis again points out that this commits a regress identified by the British philosopher Bradley, who is the preeminent philosopher of the end of the 19th century, who was the teacher of, well, he wasn't a teacher of Russell, but he was the teacher of that generation of philosophers that rejected him and became common sense. G.E. Moore, that's who he was the teacher of, G.E. Moore. And Moore was originally his acolyte and then sort of rejected everything he stood for. Anyway, Bradley was an idealist, which is irrelevant to this, but he made a point that Lewis uses against this suggestion. And he says, wait a minute, why do you even need a copula? Why do you need to join the predicate to the subject? Doesn't it do that anyway? Isn't predication just a predicate attaching to a subject? If you need this extra thing, the copula, well then it sounds like you open the door to needing another copula to attach the copula to the subject. If things need something else to join them, then you're going to keep needing them, and this is the regress. You're always going to need more. You're going to need an infinite string of copulas once you introduce one. The best thing is to not introduce them at all. All right, so as you can see, there are, depending on your stance on these problems, you're going to think that the theory, which of these problems you think is more serious, is going to decide whether or not you're a perdurance or endurance. How does exdurance fare? Well, notice that exdurance says that there aren't two things having incompatible properties. Which the problem with endurance is it says that A equals B, and they have incompatible properties, and that's why you have to get into relationism and all that. Whereas exdurance says, no, then this is the only real one. This is its counterpart. It's not the same. So we're not violating Leibniz. This can't be the same because of Leibniz's law. It has different properties. So you don't get the contradiction. But you also have this thing existing all at once. So if you like the idea of objects existing all at once and you just object to the idea that this isn't all of me, this is just a tiny fragment of me, if you object to that, then exdurance is your theory. Okay, let's look at some other puzzles that also might decide your view on whether or not you're a perdurance or an endurance theorist. The statue and the clay, we came across this in the previous section. So the statue and the clay are, I got a lump of clay, I mold it into a statue, the statue exists for a day, and then I say, I hate that statue, and I squash the clay again. Now, during the day that the statue exists, the statue and clay are made of exactly one and the same things. So if I point at it and says, there's the statue, and you ask, where's the clay? I will say, well, there, the clay's there too. And you say, well, which is which? And I say, well, they're one and the same. But how can they be one and the same, given that the statue has only existed for a short time, whereas the clay has existed for much longer? How can they have different properties but be identical? That violates Leibniz's law. You can't have that happen. And there are all sorts of properties that the statue has that the clay doesn't. For example, the statue is clearly vulnerable to squishing, because once I squish it, the statue no longer exists. But the clay clearly is not vulnerable to squishing, because once I squish the statue, the clay still exists. The clay is not bothered. So there's all sorts of properties that the statue has that the clay doesn't. And yet, for a day, they are made of exactly the same things. How can that be? How can you have one and the same thing in terms of made of exactly the same stuff with different properties? That's a puzzle. Okay, another puzzle, a related puzzle, is, I don't know, I think it's David Wiggins who is responsible for the Tib and Tibbles example, but you can do any kind of version of this. But suppose I have a cat called Tibbles that has a tail, but there's also an object that I'm going to call Tib that consists of Tibbles minus Tibbles' tail. Now, Tibbles has a tail, but Tib exists, just doesn't include the tail. And, in case you think, well, what kind of object is that? We talk of it like my arm. My arm exists. It's a real object, but even if it's attached to me, it exists as an object. Or my torso exists. It's an object. It's not all of me. There's me that exists, and my torso also exists. So Tibbles exists and Tib exists. And they're two different things, right? They have different properties. So yes, my torso exists and I exist, and we have no objection to saying that they both exist and they're different objects. Why do we have no objection? Because they have different properties. I'm much bigger than my torso. Tib is smaller than Tibbles. Of course, you can see what's coming. Somebody snips off Tibbles' tail. Horrible persons. Well, maybe it's cancerous. Maybe it has to be removed. See, Tibbles is pretty pissed about this. And the tail is gone. Now, Tibbles still exists, right? Because you can survive the loss of your tail. No problem. We can survive the loss of all kinds of things. So Tibbles still exists, and Tib still exists because we didn't affect Tib. We cut off a tail which wasn't even part of Tib. But you can see the problem now is that they're exactly the same. Whereas before they were different, now they're exactly the same. So at this moment, Tib and Tibbles both exist, but they're one and the same, like the statue and the clay. How is that possible? And various solutions that try to avoid puzzling things, like saying that you can have two identical things made of the same stuff can have different properties, seemingly in violation of Leibniz's law. We've got to try and avoid that. How do we do it? Obviously, you can see where a four-dimensional view, where you believe in temporal parts, is useful. Well, maybe not obvious, so let me make it obvious. That didn't help, did it? If you believe in temporal parts, then there's no contradiction, because what you say is that, well, look at the statue and the clay. The statue and the clay are never identical. The problem only arises if Tib and Tibbles are one and the same thing, which is what an endurance theorist has to say. If you say that Tib and Tibbles exist all at once, well, the thing that exists all at once is both of them, and that seems like a contradiction. Whereas a perdurance theorist can say, no, Tib and Tibbles don't exist all at once. They're stretched out in time. And Tib is not the same as Tibbles. Why? Because just as Tib is a part of Tibbles here, and it's perfectly okay to have Tib and Tibbles both exist, like me and my arm both existing at the same time. Nobody's got a problem with that, because my arm is just a part of me. It's not identical with me. Well, the same thing happens with Tib and Tibbles if you're a perdurance theorist, except in time. So Tib is a part of Tibbles. Now, actually, statue and clay is a better example here. But Tib and Tibbles don't have identical properties because Tib never has a tail. There is no point in the history of Tib where Tib has a tail, whereas Tibbles does have a tail for the early part of Tibbles' life. So they don't have identical properties. So there's no problem in violating Leibniz's law. Statue in the clay. The statue only exists for a day. So it is a temporal part of the clay. Just like my arm is a spatial part of me. And there's no problem with saying that a part exists at the same time as the whole, and you can talk about them separately, but they both exist. Nobody has an objection with that. The only objection is if one and the same thing has different properties. And the temporal parts theorist says, no problem. Now, so what is happening is that there is a stretch of time in which the statue and the clay share a part, the part that exists for a day. So that is a temporal part of both the statue and the clay. But that's fine. You can have the same thing be a part of two different objects. Think of conjoined twins. They sometimes share a heart. They both have a heart. So they're two different entities. You can talk to them separately. They're different individuals, but they share a heart. Or, two houses in a terraced row. They share a wall. One wall is part of one house. It's also part of the other. But that doesn't mean they're one and the same house. No, they're two different houses. They just share a part. Same with the statue and the clay. They're two different objects. No violation of Leibniz's law. Problem solved. The only objection to this is, well, all right, what if they exactly overlap in time? So you make the lump of clay and the statue at the same time, and then you destroy the lump of clay and the statue at the same time. Then it seems like looks like you can't pull that trick. They have all the same properties, and they exist at exactly the same time. So you can't say that one is a part of the other, or at least a proper part of the other, because everything is a part of itself, at least in the usual understanding. But a proper part is a part other than the whole. What if they exactly overlap in time? Well, at which point the Perdurance theorist, well, one thing they could say is, well, then they're not different objects, really. Anyway, if you are an endurance theorist, though, what are you going to say? Is this the killer move that makes us all be Perdurancists, or can an endurance theorist say something about this? Well, one view is the view that says constitution. So applying to the statue and the clay, it says they're not identical. They exist of entirely the same stuff at the same time, but they're not identical. One constitutes the other, and constitution and identity are not the same relationship. at which point theorists, a lot of theorists, including some non-perdurance theorists, start narrowing the eyes and saying, well, what's this constitution business? That seems a little bit magical. When is one thing identical with another, and when does one thing constitute another? And they're made of exactly the same stuff. You still have the problem of them being made of exactly the same stuff, but having different properties. The clay constitutes the statue, but is not vulnerable to squishing, whereas the statue is vulnerable to squishing. And then you seem to be saying that the whole is distinct from the parts. Because if you get rid of the parts, you've got rid of the statue. But if you get rid of the statue, you haven't gotten rid of the parts. So how does that work? It's a very, it seems like a neat solution. Oh yeah, the statue and clay, it's just that they're not the same. It's just that one is made of the other. One constitutes the other. But once you get past the label and try and spell out exactly how this is work and the rules of constitution, it gets a bit trickier. Then there's the dominant sorts suggestion, which is that the thing exists that is the dominant kind. So, and statues always trump clay. When there is no statue, then the clay exists. But once the clay is formed into a statue, it's the statue that exists. So what happened to the clay? Answer, while the statue exists, the clay does not exist. Huh? So the clay just vanishes? The clay ceases to exist? Now, if you're a perdurance theorist making this kind of, oh, well, what happens to the clay? You're on kind of thin, shaky ground, because what happened to the baby? The baby is just a time slice. The baby and time slices just come into existence and go out of existence. So for perdurance theorists, there are a number of entities that just exist for a very short time, and then poof, they come into existence, they exist, and they pop out of existence. Like that baby no longer exists. And in fact, this version of me, gone. It doesn't exist anymore. Now, the whole thing is me. I haven't gone out of existence, but each of the parts goes out of existence, only exists for a very short time, and then is replaced by another one, somehow magically. So there are maybe problems for perdurance theorists in this respect. But there's also the problem of what classifier trumps what other one? Why is the statue the thing that gets to exist at the expense of the clay? Why doesn't clay trump statue? How does that work? And it sounds like that's a little anthropomorphic. It's just based on our preferences. And that's where Sider gets into talking about, imagine if aliens divide things into things inside and things outside, and those are their sorts. Who decides whether their sorts or our sorts should be dominant? So there is, those are the three responses to these puzzles of constitution. I gotta say, it sounds to me like the temporal parts one has the more convincing account, but maybe because I've just read Ted Sider and he's a four-dimensionalist. I'm easily convinced. All right, one more thing I have to say is talk a little bit about the combination of presentism and serious tensing. Now, serious tensing is not relationism. It suggests that that propositions just have tensed properties. So what it is to be, remember, A-theorists believe in serious tensing. They believe that that propositions come with built-in tense. So something is green is different from saying it was green. In fact, if you're a presentist, you believe, so the combination of presentism and serious tensing it says that, for example, the tomato is red now and was green before. Now, the subject is, being green now is an intrinsic property because it's not really related to time. So it's just the only thing, the only way something can be red now is to exist, because that's the presentism part. So things really have intrinsic properties, thus avoiding Lewis's criticism. And they don't have contradictory properties because there's no sense in which this is also green. It's not also green, it's just red. So there's no contradiction. But then, well, in that case, do we have the difference? What's the change? Well, because this has the property of having been green, which is a different property. Now, what Lewis says, a couple of things, our old friend David Lewis. He says, persistence requires things to be present at different times, but presentism says they're only around at one time, because the only time that exists is the present. So there's no sense in which you have an existing green tomato and an existing red tomato. You only have an existing red tomato. So where's the change? Change should be existing green tomato becomes existing red tomato. But you only have an existing red tomato, according to Lewis's criticism. What is it that makes it true that it was red? Nothing. There's nothing that exists that makes it true that it was red. So this is where he uses his language of ersatzism. He's saying, you're saying it was red because of it has a property now of being was red. You can't say that it was red because it exists as a red thing over here, because you don't believe the past exists. So you just are telling some story to claim that it was red, but was green. But in fact, it's just red. So there's no change happening. That's Lewis's criticism. But that's the response. That's where presentism and serious tensing seems to avoid this criticism, at least. All right, there's a lot more to say, but I've run out of strength, so we'll leave it there.